All right, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining our online event. We are really excited to have you. My name is Jacqueline Kelly, and I am the secretary for the University of St. Andrews Anthropology Society. Our society holds social and academic events for people interested in anthropology in the university. An upside of hosting online events is having them open to a broader audience. So wherever you're joining from, we are really happy to have you. Just to let you know that the topic of health and well-being is sensitive, and there will likely be discussion on topics concerning mental health disorders during the event. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our 4 speakers today so they can tell you a bit more about themselves and their research. We'll start with Dr. Bridget Bradley.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for inviting us to take part in this event. For me personally, I've just joined the department fairly recently last semester, so this is a really nice opportunity to kind of foster a bit of community for those of us that are working on health and illness. And I haven't actually met any of you in person yet, so that's kind of sad, but thanks for the virtual world for bringing us together. My work very broadly looks at topics of mental health and community activism. My PhD research focused on a group of behaviours that are not very well known, have a very low kind of public awareness and actually a medical awareness as well. They're known as body-focused repetitive behaviours, and that includes compulsive hair pulling, compulsive skin picking, and my research mostly took place in the UK. So as part of this project, I worked with men, women and children who live with these behaviours and experience the compulsive obsessive urge to pick skin and pull out hair. These often begin in childhood or adolescence. So the people I was talking to had often many years of embarrassment and shame relating to these behaviours, and for many, actually, I was the first person that they had really opened up to as to share their experiences. So that was very interesting. And due to the low public profile about these conditions and low awareness really for people themselves, not understanding why they do this, where it comes from, there was a real sense that my interlocutors expected me to do something to help raise awareness, to help support them, to help connect them with other people. So very quickly this project took on a kind of an advocacy or an activist angle. That also came from the fact that I have been living with compulsive hair pulling since I was a child, so my own kind of insider-outsider status brought that together in important ways. So that research was very interesting and took me in lots of interesting directions that we can talk about maybe, but highlighted for me the importance that, you know, research on health can have actually for everyday life for the people that we work with, and was incredibly meaningful for me in my own journey as well. Beyond that, I've just started new research on eco-anxiety in the UK, which again brings together kind of topics of mental health and activism. So we're looking at climate activism in the UK and experiences of anxiety, depression, fear, grief, and yeah, and all of that relating to the climate crisis. And this has really just begun, so don't have any findings to share with you yet, but looking forward to seeing where that takes me. I think that's about all I have time to say.
Great. Thank you so much. Next, we're going to move on to Dr. Mattia Fumanti.
Hi, Jacqueline and Benjamin and everyone else. Thank you very much for having me to speak at this event on health and well-being. I came to St. Andrews now about 10 years ago, and I started, I came into the research on kind of medical anthropology and mental health quite late, I have to say. My PhD was on a completely unrelated topic. I worked with youth and elite in a small town in northern Namibia. And then I continued to work in Namibia, which is a place I've been for the last 20 years. Worked on youth and popular culture and music. And then at some point I ended up doing research with the African diaspora, the African diaspora in London, on religion and citizenship, and worked mostly with first generation Ghanaian migrants to Britain and their constructions of ideas of citizenship in Britain. Then I went back to Namibia and I decided to begin to work on mental health, which was a topic that I'd started to read on the previous years, and then I decided to kind of move into this direction. And so I worked first with two young men I'd known for many, many years, and I'd known their family for quite some time. And we were supposed to do a film about living with mental illness in Namibia. But then their lives were kind of particularly difficult, the ways in which they were managing their condition due to a number of issues that we could talk about, later on. But mostly, Namibia, it's a country which has the legacy of apartheid and colonialism impinges greatly on the access to mental health resources in the country, and people do have access to a kind of plural arena of resources, including traditional medicine and so on and so forth. But the experiences of these two young men was particularly challenging, and so we stopped, and then I went back to work mostly in the archives. And then I had a Wellcome Trust small seed award. I went back and worked with artists and local practitioners, trying to collect narratives and experiences of mental illness using a different range of methodologies. That was a few years ago, and now I kind of continue to cultivate this interest, and I've been planning, perhaps if we get the money, to do a project on the impact of COVID on mental health and well-being in Britain among young people. But that's really preliminary. Anyway, that's all. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Next, we're going to introduce Dr. Salma Siddique. Sorry, I think you're on mute.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, conferencing platform faux pas. Okay, I'm just so fascinated with the sort of introductions I've heard so far. And in very similar terms, I'm very interested in the notions and ideas of performance of mental illness and mental ill health within a social, family, and a societal context. And particularly, I'm interested in temporality, and because my background is I work as a therapist. I work with adults and children, and it's amazing. The notion of temporality and time and space has really transfigured. If anything, it's reconfigured for people, and the notion of time has really shifted. Has been rather been fixed because of this enforced incarceration. So and that has a huge impact on people's mental health and well-being. And I came to St Andrews as an undergraduate, did my doctorate at St Andrews. You could say I was a bit institutionalized, but I just love the work of Rivers and sort of Bateson and people like that, who are looking at mental ill health in the context of a cultural milieu rather than from a Western gaze. And I think I was first in my undergraduate when we talked about Freud. And Freud came in relationship with Levi-Strauss and the Kuna shaman. and some of the birthing rituals. And I think from that moment, the idea of the symbolic and the internal world, I was hooked. And I really liked for us to think about anthropology of the interior. We never look to that degree of anthropology of the unconscious. When two unconscious processes meet, we create the space for the third. And in a way, it's a deeper relational narrative we're missing around the transformative aspect of mental ill health. I come from a culture which is Islam and Sufism. In one sense, it's a very open and performative space to look at mental ill health. I've spent for my doctorate as well as early years worked in the psychiatric closed ward system, where they had a lot of people with psychosis from different cultures as well as Western cultures as well. And the control and the restraint prevented performance and articulation. And I thought that was far more inhumane than anything possible mental ill health could do. So I think it's looking at the societal narrative, a lot more starting to be done and looked at. But I think in anthropology, it's got a fantastic methodology of ethnographical participant observation, the relational space to actually create some sort of transformation. And Bridget talked about this idea of being an advocate or an activist. And I think we all are drawn into that, because in a way we all owe some sort of a loyalty and responsibility when we engage in the world of the other. And I think there's something about relational ethics that maybe we could explore around vulnerable people with mental ill health. So thank you for the opportunity for speaking.
Thank you very much for your intro. And then we'll finally introduce Dr. Laura Rue.
Hello. Just before I begin, my neighbours are having new windows fitted, so if you hear like a really aggressive banging, it's because of that. Anyway, yeah, I graduated from my PhD in June of last year from the department, and I also did my undergrad at St Andrews, so part of the furniture, I suppose. But my work focuses on substance addiction in Scotland, specifically heroin and polydrug use, and like Salma, I suppose, I focus on how that affects experiences of time and temporality. So I did my research for that in 2017, I think it was, mostly in different recovery sort of focused organisations like needle exchanges and a local community recovery group. And then in the last sort of 5 months, I was more with a fairly scattered group of individual sort of heroin users, just accompanying them in their daily lives. And I've kept up with most of them in the last sort of 4 years or so. So my research tends to focus on non-clinical, non-institutional settings. Although those are kind of interwoven with daily life anyway, so they crop up constantly. So when I began, I was also interested in experiences of things like grief and loss and trauma, as well as things like intimacy and pleasure, and how these were shaped by time as well. So yeah, so there was lots of things to talk about with time. It's really time focused, but I won't go on about that. But I think time experience also goes on to have a lot of general repercussions for recovery and for general health as well. So I would say that health and well-being was not something that I particularly focused on, I have to say. Although even though I maybe wasn't that cognizant of it at the time, it's really present in the research, because the challenges in health for substance users are abundant, really. There's so much comorbidity, and there's access to health services is a really big issue, as well as much worsened health outcomes compared with, say, the general population, as well as things like overdose prevalence and stuff like that. So, and the research, obviously, it took place in the context of Scotland having and continuing to have the highest drug-related deaths in Europe. So my current project, what I'm working on at the moment with Richard Irvine, is kind of exploring these patterns of overdose and drug use in the context of specifically Scotland's industrial and post-industrial history. So aspects of health kind of come into that as well. So how those are shaped through time and related to Scotland's sort of industrial history. And that's kind of where we're at the moment. So yeah, thank you.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Thank you all very much for your introductions. It's really really cool to hear about your all your research and what you've been doing recently. Now we're going to move on to the question and answer portion of the event. So for all of our guests, we welcome you to ask any questions. Just use the chat function, or you can raise your hand on Teams and unmute, whichever works best for you. So we'll get started with some of the questions we have here. The first one is, what made you want to study the anthropology of health and well-being? Would anyone like to go first? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, well, basically, as a child, spending my summer holidays in Pakistan and in rural parts, sort of experienced a lot of kind of shamanic chanting, sort of healing rituals and stuff that really sort of fascinated me. So the member of society who was physically or mentally ill was never ostracized from that community. They were sort of brought into the center of the community, fed by the community. And as I was growing up, I really noticed that very much of the whole healing that is community based. So that's what interested me in the whole subject. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Salma. Go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like I said in the introduction, it wasn't really a purposeful focus in the study on health or well-being and things, but just doing the research and over the past few years, I suppose it's really interesting to think about, or what kind of draws you in is just the massive sort of health inequality faced by substance users and people I work with. So looking at the kind of structural factors that kind of shape general health, mental health, physical health. It's so complex and so difficult, and there's so much stigma as well, I think, that features into it. So it's difficult to look at anything else in relation to addiction and substance use without being aware of that, because it really features in all parts of daily life as well. So that's probably what interests me about that. So yeah, thank you.
Definitely, thank you. Go ahead, Mattia.
Yeah, thank you. I think that the thing that drew me to study of mental health and well-being was that even during my early project and then my subsequent visits to Namibia, what really was striking, which echoes things that have been said by Salma and Laura, is the relationship between, of course, health and inequalities. And Namibia was undergoing a deep crisis due to the HIV/AIDS pandemic. And there was a very high rate of seroprevalence in the country, and people were dying really in great numbers. And people were getting ill, and they were approaching the illness through a quest for well-being. You have to bear in mind that in the mid-2000s and early 2000s, there were no antiretroviral drugs in Namibia or elsewhere in the continent, and Namibia began a rollout of free antiretroviral drugs only in the second decade of the 21st century. So people were really trying to find ways to be healed and cured. And they were going to Pentecostal churches, traditional, more Orthodox churches, but also traditional healers and so on and so forth. And then, so this was always kind of in the background of what I was doing. But then when I went back, and then these two young men, which I was very close to, began experiencing psychosis. And I could see theirs and their family, again, quest for well-being within that particular context. And you know, Namibia has only 2 psychiatric wards, of which one is really completely understaffed. So we could say there's only 1 psychiatric ward in the capital. It's a very vast country with very long distances. And so people have to do with what they have, also within their understanding of what illness is, which is a, you know, kind of echoing what Salma was saying, a very intersubjective experience. and a social experience. And so people find healing in relation with others. And so the approach is never exclusively individual, but it's part of a wider process of healing the wider community of the subject who suffers. So so that was it. Thanks.
Bridget, do you want to have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I remember this like real moment in my undergrad studies, which was at Manchester, but in the UK, where, I mean, I'd always loved anthropology and I was enjoying my studies very much, but until I took my first medical anthropology course, I think I didn't really realise what anthropology could do. And I was often very frustrated with just the reading and writing for reading and writing's sake. And we were suddenly reading, you know, Paul Farmer and Nancy Shepherd Hughes and things, you know, Nancy Shepherd Hughes, this famous article of militant anthropology, and that we have this kind of ethical responsibility, kind of what Salma was saying earlier, to do something. And while there are lots of critiques with that, obviously, that we can maybe unpack, but for me, it was a real excitement, actually, of, wow, this could actually make a difference to people's lives. I can finally see how we could use ways of anthropological thinking and research to actually work with communities and make a difference. And I come from, both my parents are kind of social workers or have done social work. So I think that activist streak was in me from a young age. And was more relatable than the more theoretical and jargon-filled stuff I was often reading. So, but my decision to go on and do research was kind of by accident. I did a taught master's kind of immediately after that, mostly just because I had no idea what I was doing with my life, in medical anthropology, and but I did some of my own research for my dissertation, even though it was a taught program. And I decided to do research on hairpooling just because I had lived with it for so long. I had never really thought about it. I thought it might be interesting and just different. I had no idea that I would kind of go on this journey then to like turn it into a PhD project. That was completely accidental. And I'm glad I did it, but it was unexpected in many, many ways. So yeah, kind of by accident, but also by surprise. And I think now that I've been teaching sub-honours again in medical anthropology this year, it's reminded me of those early classes and how much that kind of inspiration can really help to trigger interest and I've never left really, and that's kind of cool.
Great, thank you. It was really interesting to hear how you all got into the field. Now moving on to our second question, which is what barriers of entry have you experienced in your field of specific research?
Can I jump in based on what Salma said? I also, in my work, have to deal a lot with psychologists and psychiatrists as interlocutors, but also at kind of events where I am the only anthropologist and they are the experts in hairpooling, because until my thesis, I think nobody really wrote or thought about hairpooling in this qualitative or intensely qualitative way. And that has felt like a barrier in field work, because trying to get into those spaces and convince those people that they were my research subjects, which they're not used to doing, not used to that idea, was quite challenging. And I still feel like, and maybe every anthropologist feels this way, but like you don't fit in anywhere. You're always the odd one out in any space. You're never fully part, you're never fully native, you're never fully part of any space, and you're always just the odd one out. And I struggle still to communicate the value of my work to those audiences. I think they just don't get it. And it's very hard to prove to them that this is a form of science or a form of evidence in that way. So I think that is a barrier. And again, like Salma, in very different ways, of course, I think personal experience and what happens to us in the field is always a barrier in some way and can really shift what happens in fieldwork and what happens in so many different ways, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. So yeah.
Thank you, Bridget.
I think, oh, sorry if I'm interrupting. Just on that as well, when I'm thinking about the barriers in my own fieldwork was, I guess, a lot of trust issues of working with the people that I worked with, especially when they knew or when I told them that I didn't have any experiences of substance use or addiction myself. So there was a bit of a gap there, I think, in experience, which made people a bit uncomfortable, which is perfectly understandable, I think. So it was, which is why I think anthropology needs to sometimes take such a long time to be fully, to work in that way. What was I going to say? Yeah, just because, but I think that's also why there's such a call for more research done by people who have these sorts of experiences, which is happening a lot. In addiction circles as well, there's more emphasis on that. Sorry, I'm not sure where I was going with that, but yeah, but that was a real barrier, I think, in my fieldwork, was not having that experience, and then which raised really interesting, I think, questions about empathy and the limits of empathy as well in how we can work and operate. So it's something I continue to think about. Yeah, maybe we'll get onto that as well if we talk about ethics later.
Yeah, I think, I mean, my comments echo what has been said, and the issue of trust, as Laura raised, is very, very important. Working in a post-colonial, post-apartheid context, you know, I was very aware and remain very aware about the incredible power inequalities that anthropologists carry in the field. And in my case, you know, I'm a white male European anthropologist doing research on mental illness with Namibians, would have carried kind of a reproduction of old clinical inequalities of the white male doctor coming in, extracting narratives for his or her own advantage. I mean, one of the things that really drove me to the anthropology of mental ill health is all this very interesting work by people like Arthur Kleinman, but also Byron Good, people who work on issues of intersubjectivity and cultural sensitivity and subject making through the experience of mental ill health. And they always and all look at the ways in which people are kind of part of a moral world based on relationality with them and others, significant others, but the wider society, but also how forces like race and history and colonialism continue to affect the experiences of people who go through experiences of ill health. So my one of the things that I was trying to do, which of course was very difficult, and which constituted a barrier, was to try and work around ways in which the people I've encountered could work their way around their experiences by sharing with others who also suffer what they have been going through. So thinking about methodologies that were, of course, this inequality of my position could never be completely eliminated, but still methodologies where there was a space for a more equal or peer-to-peer approach to healing. And one of the things that I really loved watching, and I showed in class years ago, is a film by Karen Nakamura called Bethel Community and Schizophrenia in Northern Japan, which is an incredibly powerful film about people suffering from psychosis in this clinic, where they share and they kind of as a peer-to-peer way of recovering. So sorry, that's my.
Could I just add a little bit? I was just as everybody was talking, I just remembered one thing about. I worked in the psychiatric system in England, and there was locked wards, secure settings, and I was really taken how difficult it was for me to form a relationship with the black staff, because they knew I was doing anthropology, and they said it was a 18th century colonialistic pursuit, and that I was and there's so much so they refer to me as a coconut, you know, black on the outside, white on the inside, that I was sort of imbued with all the values and these cultural things of oppression, and I was reproducing it in my work. So I had a very tough time trying to get them alongside me, whereas the white staff was, actually, you're not enough psychologically minded, you don't know enough sciences. So I was quite invisible to them, and occasionally I would meet something in the middle, and they would be the deeply psychotic patients who would take me alongside. And then when I explained to them I was an anthropologist doing research, they would refer to me as an archaeologist digging up the dirt. And I thought, what a beautiful metaphor for what we do. We dig up the dirt. So thank you for that.
Amazing, thank you. I like how you wrapped that up. Oh, did anyone have anything to add? No. Okay, amazing. We'll move on to the next question. Which is very similar to what Mattia was talking about earlier about.
Jackie, can we go into the chat? There's some people asking questions in the chat.
I can't see any questions.
Okay.
You can send them, Ben, just to ask them.
Okay, so this question is from Ivy Elise. She asks a general question on what changes in the anthropology of health and well-being have you seen in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic?
I can jump in if no one minds. Yeah, I think major change would be a lot of anthropologists capitalizing on the system for publications and more research, myself included. So maybe a shift in like research priorities have had to happen just to deal with the fact that there's been such a fundamental change to everyday circumstances and things like that. I think as well in my specific context, there's maybe been a bit of a shift away in government priorities and research priorities towards COVID transmission, and maybe away from overdose prevalence and things to deal with overdose, because even though both are kind of very acute crises, I suppose just because overdose has such a long-standing ongoing kind of that there is that shift. So I think anthropology needs to adjust to that as well and see why that's happening and kind of account for that in research as well. I think so much of the pandemic exacerbating things that were already there, like isolation and so much strain on mental health that is also coming into medical anthropology research during the pandemic. So yeah.
I would just like to add a bit onto what Laura said. Is I think I'm absolutely shocked and appalled how the Doreen Lawrence, who was sitting on a panel to produce a research document on why people from ethnic minorities were more likely to, suffer in the pandemic or lose their lives, and actually a lot of richness came out of that report, and it was about basically health inequalities, poverty, and also this idea of appeasement. People felt that they could not go to work, could not say no because the status or the level that they were working on. So she brought up this very fundamental issue about this idea of postulating to the hierarchy, and where people of color were in the hierarchy around employment, and therefore they were more vulnerable. So I think there's a fundamental issue here for medical anthropology to look at that, about the sort of the inequalities around race that have been signified by the pandemic. Thank you.
Bridget, Mattia, do you have something to add?
Sorry, my internet disappeared, so I have no idea what anybody else said. This was about COVID-19 and
Anthropology of health and well-being. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this. Apologies if I'm repeating what other people have said. The pandemic has been really interesting because I think it's highlighted the benefits of medical anthropology and our, ways of thinking. But I think it's also there's a tendency for all anthropologists now to kind of become experts in health, because we have this shared experience that everybody wants to kind of follow and document in their own way, which is a very interesting turning point, because in my experience anyway, social and medical anthropology have often been framed as completely different, disciplines, and I've never really known where I belong in those two camps. So I think blurring the lines between them is a great thing, and and just revealing the kind of potential for theoretical ways of thinking about the pandemic, but also practical things that we can do to actually make a difference. And
It's interesting you say that, Bridget, because you remind me of my PhD supervisor. She said to me when I mentioned medical anthropology, says, prefix or suffix, it's anthropology.
Yeah, exactly. And I agree. I've always felt like, my work is as much about gender and kinship as it is about health and illness. But I felt other people have tried to kind of force me into that field or in Edinburgh, where the department I was in before, we had a kind of a set centre for medical anthropology, which meant you kind of had to self-identify if you wanted to be part of that club, which was often problematic. So maybe we're doing the same thing today by forming a community at St Andrews. But I think the pandemic has helped with that. We've all had to become experts in health and illness, but we also have to become experts in online methods. So those two things together are kind of developments that the discipline will have to continue doing.
Yeah, I think, I echo what's been said again. I think that the pandemic has highlighted deep-seated inequalities in access to health, on race and gender and class. And this covers every aspect of our life, or what we took for granted before the pandemic. If one has to think about the experience of children and homeschooling in Britain, which is one of the most industrialized countries in the world, over 1 million laptops had been donated by the government to families where there were no electronic devices. So that's, for example, it's a deep inequality, which has to do with social and economic factor. But in terms of health, of course, there is this great disparity in the number of people from Black and ethnic minorities in these countries who have died or contracted COVID, as opposed to their white British counterparts. And the impact that this pandemic would have on the mental health and well-being of people would be felt for a very long time after the pandemic is over, when we don't know, but that is one issue. And of course, in different countries, in different places, this has affected people in similar but different ways, of course. And I just read the other day that the government of Japan has instituted a Ministry of Solitude for the people who have been affected by isolation during the COVID pandemic. And statistics about suicide are always very complex and difficult, and one would have to really look at a myriad of data to say whether there is an increase or not, but it shows that allegedly there's more people are taking their lives in the pandemic year in Japan than had been in the previous years. So of course we are here sitting and yes, medical anthropology, as Bridget was saying, or anthropology could perhaps bring in more complex an understanding of these issues than other disciplines might do, or working alongside other disciplines. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you very much. There's another question in the chat from Chiara. She, or not gonna presume, but they are mostly targeting this question at Bridget, but I'm gonna put it to everybody in the group as well. Can you speak about any tensions or discomfort between anthropological knowledge and in quotation marks, and let's say activist knowledge in quotation marks, and recognizing there's an overlap? Do you experience any moments where you speak about things that perhaps go against what activism around, let's say, hair pulling might advocate for?
Thank you, Kira. A really good question, and I think, yeah, I think Benjamin's right. This, this speaks to much bigger questions of representation in a way, and how we deal with the data we get and how we represent the communities we work with. We often disagree with what we hear in the field, or what people tell us, or what other experts tell us. So yeah, there have been tensions for me with those two different types of knowledge. One debate I got very interested in was the question of whether hair pulling and skin picking are forms of self-harm, which I just found it fascinating that people were so against the idea that they were. And obviously, as an anthropologist, when somebody is, when there's this tension, you're drawn to it. And so I've had to stay very cautious around that topic about writing about it, because my interlocutors are very, very adamant that hair pulling and skin picking are not forms of self-harm for different reasons. But for me, that opens up so many interesting questions about what we perhaps imagine self-harm to be, and why or why not this does not seem to fit in, or perhaps about stigma, why self-harm is so stigmatized that we are wary of that as a label. And also in terms of treatment and recovery, I mean, I've been very critical of kind of what Salma was talking about psychological and psychiatric responses to these types of behaviours. And in the community, when I was doing my fieldwork, and still ongoing, are lots of conversations about cures and how do we develop biomarkers to see who has these hair pulling tendencies from a young age and then intervene. And that opens up so many different conversations about disability, quality of life, that I think are hugely problematic. And kind of like what Salma said, behaviour out of place or out of context, as you said it. And I think more about understanding how hair pulling, why is hair pulling so shameful, and why does it make people's lives so miserable, is mostly just due to the shame and the stigma that surrounds it, rather than the effect it actually has on people's lives. And so in my fieldwork, by coming together, by sharing this kind of peer thing that Mattia was talking about, peer-led healing, actually made people's lives so much better and made them happier and able to live with these behaviours rather than trying to cure them or fix them. So I think I feel very strongly about that, and I think it's just about how we present our data, but I am conscious of when we write about these things, how does the community respond, and what do we open ourselves up for in terms of criticism?
Can I just add that what you're saying, Bridget, I totally agree with. And Mattia just talked about this idea of the Department of Solitude, you know, it sounds like a Koshogo novel, but actually, you know, working as a therapist, as a clinical anthropologist, I realized how much an individual needs community and society to mediate and express distress and suffering. And out with that, it's not possible, because particularly young people and single people who are in this sort of lockdown mode have got no contact. Therefore, the expression, the articulation, and the performance of their condition is actually is in a way impacting more on them than if they were within community and relationship. Equally, as Bridget says, it can work. It's a flip of a coin. It can work also in a negative way, to be in relationship in a community. I've got clients, because they're isolated, they're doing a lot better. They don't need to speak to anybody to reinforce the dynamic. So there's something about, as anthropologists, we look at people and how they're situated in relationships, either mediate or sort of exacerbate conditions.
Laura, Mattia, do you have something to add, or?
Yeah, I was just going to echo what's kind of already been said about in anthropology of addiction and drug use, that anthropology often aligns very well with sort of activist agendas and programs, because I think it pays a lot of attention to the kind of social and historical things that are underlining addiction, which is in quite opposition to very prevalent sort of medical models. So there's quite a lining of goals. But also that the addiction sort of activism is not monolithic in any way. There's so much disagreement, and there's so much, you know, it's not a cohesive kind of thing. So there's really interesting kind of debates that conflict with each other about, say, whether it needs to be focused on recovery, whether there are alternative options that are not recovery focused, maybe even critiquing sort of harm reduction models, which is very interesting. So yeah, none of these things are coherent, and there's so much disagreement there. So it's quite difficult to pick your way through that. But I think you've just got to be sensitive to those kinds of issues, definitely. So.
Mattia, do you have anything to add? No? Okay, awesome. We have a question from Sarah in the chat, which is to the whole group, which is, can you talk a bit more about some of the practical contributions that your research has impacted outside of academia? For example, policy changes.
Can I speak about Sarah's question? Okay. So she asks about the idea impact. My research work has impacted other therapists as well as also doing some policy work around race and culture and mental health, ill health as well. And also I see anthropologists as well as a therapist who have got usually writer's block for their thesis, or they've come back from the field and they're quite traumatized by what they've seen. And I think with all these years that I've been doing that, one thing I've really learned is anthropology needs to shift a gear. Rather than it being an armchair-based subject, I think we need to look at it as a very practice-orientated, and medical anthropology is the best place to start. By that I mean that maybe we should start looking at placements, that people go and do a medical placement while they're studying for their medical anthropology, because otherwise it's just a theoretical self-indulgence that actually, once you're out of the university, you know, it's either Greg's or McDonald's. But I think a real engagement in the subject right from day one in some level of practice, because when I was doing my undergraduate and my master's and then my doctorate, I was working in practice. I was working in clinical settings all the way through my courses. I had rich material. It changed me, and it's also made me more humane towards the suffering of others as well. And I think medical anthropology can't sit on a shelf. It needs to be situated in the context of a setting of practice. Thank you.
Yes, I'm just building on what Salma said. One of the things I tried to do with that project was to bring together medical practitioners in Namibia alongside people who work on art and art therapy and the patients in particular settings. And there's a holistic clinic in Windhoek, which has taken on a more holistic approach to mental ill health. And so I took part in the workshop that we set together. And of course, it's a very limited experience on my part of what it means to be within a setting as such, as Salma was talking about, many years of experience in many different settings. But of course, the ways in which you're drawn in with other peoples and the possibilities of digging within your world of emotions alongside that of others on shared activities and shared practices really has had a very big impact, even if I did very small or little of it because of the length of the project. But anyway, I think, I totally agree with what Salma had said, really.
I might go next, Laura. I'm not sure if you're going. I also completely agree. I think I love the idea of training in something else at the same time. I think that would have really helped me if I had had some kind of training, counselling training, for example, because I took on that role, because people expected it in a way, and I did not anticipate that I would be the only person that people would have to kind of talk to. And for that reason, I actually very quickly and early on in the project set up support groups for people. There were no support groups in the UK at all for hairpooling and skin picking until I set them up. So I did that with my interlocutors in different cities, Edinburgh and London and Manchester. Kind of because I was traveling anyway to those locations, so that was a big undertaking. But actually, out of the whole research project, and still now, I think that has been the biggest impact that my work has had and will ever have, is that those groups are still running. They've now moved online because of COVID, and we just get great numbers every month. And it helped me to bring the community together in a way, work and collaborate with my interlocutors and kind of offer something, but also alleviate the pressure on me as an individual as being the only person to talk to. But if I had had some training in counselling, I think I would have found that much easier and been better prepared, also to deal with my own, emotional responses to these stories. But it's a great idea also because, if anything, it gives you a backup if academia doesn't work out right, and if you can't get a job, then at least you're skilled in something else, because otherwise we're pretty useless, I think.
And I also, we're talking about medical anthropology and mental health and well-being. Well, what about the researchers' well-being and mental health? And I think we need to really start thinking about this idea of a multi-pronged approach, and then maybe training alongside as with some counselling skills, because you're working with vulnerable people who sees you as the main support, and actually it's about holding that space open for them as well. So maybe in the next revision of the course, there might be something about counselling.
Yeah, I think actually I had pretty similar experiences of ending up just naturally coming into a kind of advocacy role during fieldwork, because I was the only person there who could kind of do that in some circumstances. I'm not sure if I know myself, I would make an absolutely dreadful counsellor, just from personal experience, but I would question if it was my role to do that really, and whether that would maybe exacerbate the kind of power dynamics that were already there in the research. I agree, I think it would have been really helpful because I was put in that situation anyway, so having some of that kind of background might have been very beneficial to deal with those kind of emotions and those kind of stories that were coming up naturally. But it's interesting, I think it's complicated. Just on the original question about the impact, to talk about my own project, the purpose of it was supposed to have to be oriented towards policy, towards changing Scottish government policy in dealing with addiction. So that's still ongoing and it's still happening, but I think that's why anthropology is maybe quite attuned to doing that, because it can critique the policies and practices that are already in place and how they're actually lived and experienced. And I think policies already so weighted towards, for instance, the Scottish Government always says their policies are very evidence-based, they're very person-centred, research-driven, but it's so weighted towards quantitative and biomedical studies that aren't necessarily the most transparent about how they conduct their studies or what the demographics are, what the context that research is taking in place. So I think that's why anthropology is so useful in that, and that's what I hope to do with my own research, which is to kind of shift away from biomedical perspectives, or at least, you know, join those and try and broaden the horizons a bit of how we deal with, or how we make policy and how policy is implemented. So yeah.
Do you know, I was just thinking about the stint I did working in health policy, was the sort of, it's weird, research comes in and somehow people reinterpret it, or they boil it down to a few bullet points. Something gets lost between the field work, the gathering of the research, and policy implementing it, you know. So I think there's needs to be some sort of a follow through or a relationship with the original source of the research as well. Just want to add that in.
Great, thank you. Now we're going to move on to another question in the chat. This one is from Natalia, who currently works in the patient involvement advocacy sphere, and she's always been curious as to why individuals get involved with charity research policy work to improve things. Have you found that your informants want to be advocates, or are they happy just to share their stories with you? Do you think advocacy is a part of healing? Thank you.
Yes. Sorry, I'm just going to jump in and say that. I was so struck by this like relationship between talking, like connecting with others, becoming active, doing something, raising awareness, and recovery, and how and subjectivity, and that whole process. And for within my community anyway, because of the silence that surrounds hairpooling and skin picking, for me the turning point for people that I spoke to and for myself was finding out that this even had a name, right? That it was a medical disorder. Before that, people just thought that they were this freak that pulled out their hair, and that they were the only one in the world that did it. So there were years and years often of isolation and silence, and thinking that you were genuinely the only person in the world that did this weird thing. And finding out the name was often accidental, kind of just typing in like, how do you hide hair loss into Google? And then all of a sudden names come up like trichotillomania, which is the medical name for hair pulling. And this moment of discovering there was a name then led to the discovery that there might be other people just like me. So that kind of moment of diagnosis and then sociality, and then through those relationships of finding others and hearing your story echoed again and again and again in other people's experiences, was a real turning point for most people of, I need to do something with this. Like, I've lived in isolation for too long, and we're all struggling, you know, the lack of awareness and the stigma and stuff. So that triggered a lot of people to do advocacy, and through that advocacy, they started to feel better. And I mean, it was my own journey as much as it was the journey of the people I was talking to, and it was quite remarkable how similar the stories were from people. And so for me, that's completely connected. It's a cycle of, you know, the more that people raised awareness, the more likelihood there were for others to find out there was a name and then to connect with the community. So advocacy was really not for everyone, of course, and many people still choose to not tell anyone that they have these disorders, but simply knowing there are other people out there and that they're part of this community is enough. And, you know, having the support group to dip into and still remain private is important in that. But really, when people are alone, they have nothing. And then when you connect with others, the potential becomes, you know, really powerful.
Yes, I think from my research experience, I spent quite a lot of time when I did my project with a young man who is an advocate as well on mental ill health, having been diagnosed with psychosis about 20 years ago. He lives with it, and he has built quite a successful career and manages his condition. And part of his recovery or ways of dealing with illness is through advocacy. He speaks at public events. He's invited on by the local media to talk about his experience. He's been very open about it, despite the high level of stigma in the country around mental illness. And he is the founder, alongside a number of other people who had been diagnosed with mental illness in Namibia, and a group of psychiatric nurses of the Namibian Mental Health Association. And so advocacy for him was really a part of his journey of recovery and the narrative of recovery. When it comes to advocacy in a place like Namibia, I think I would find it hard to be an advocate. I mean, because it's heavily loaded for Europeans and North Americans with, you know, this kind of continuous white savior complex of going in and sorting out the life of people on the other side of the world, and you come in with your knowledge and there you are and you solve every people's problems, which of course is something that I would never want to do. And one thing that we can do in such a context is, of course, to write stories and tell the narratives that people share with you without speaking for them, but telling the stories that they want to be told and allowing them to own these stories. And you are basically a storyteller rather than the owner of these narratives. Because, of course, one of the things that the people I spoke to always tells you is that once you're diagnosed with mental illness, those experiences are taken away by the medical profession, diagnosed and prognosed and medicated, and you become silenced. So, you know, in some contexts, being an advocate is highly problematic and run the risk of causing more damage than actually doing any better for people, but for the people themselves, as you know, also Bridget said, yes, being an advocate can be a process of healing, I think.
Yeah, I agree as well. I think it was quite familiar there about how advocacy became worked into narratives of recovery and healing as well for some people in my research. I think as well, though, a lot of the potential for advocacy was really curtailed by people's circumstances. So it wasn't something that everyone had access to or the time or ability to do, because there were huge circumstances of deprivation or mental ill health, which are real barriers to engaging in activism or advocacy, as well as just forming a kind of community as well. So that's kind of disrupted as well, I think, when you're facing things like deprivation or just huge stigma and things like that. So yeah, it's a complicated thing in addiction, and it sounds like in other places as well. But that was all.
If I can jump in and just disagree with myself. I agree with everything everyone said, and you know, activism and advocacy is not an easy thing at all, and there's so many barriers to it. So I'm glad that Mattia and Laura brought up those points. Some of the, interestingly, although my first project kind of really showed this link between advocacy and healing, the early kind of conversations we're having with people around eco-anxiety are perhaps showing the opposite, where some people have said that becoming involved in climate activism has actually made their anxiety much worse, and so, you know, they're avoiding it perhaps. So I think there's an interesting contrast between the work I've done and the work we're doing now.
So as we're in like the last 15 minutes of the event, does anyone in the audience have any further questions they'd like to ask either the whole group or a specific individual? You're welcome to type them in the chat, or you can put your hand up and unmute and ask them yourself.
Jackie, we can ask about ethics.
Yeah, sure. We have a question here about ethics. When approaching accessibility in relation to sociocultural aspects, such as but not limited to race, class, disability, how do you approach your research in an ethical manner when working with potentially vulnerable people?
I think this question is, you know, we've maybe mentioned aspects of it already, but like Mattia has highlighted, having an awareness of the historical context of the places we're working in, the people we're working with, is absolutely key. And also obviously the structural factors that shape the lives of those that we're working with, the differences between, I mean, for me, the similarities were one thing of this shared experience I had with people, but I was also struck by the people that didn't want to talk to me for various reasons. So, you know, I spoke to a handful of people of colour. Black women in particular were a group that I just couldn't really access, and that was obvious for me of why I wouldn't be able to speak and gain the trust of certain people. And there was no surprise in the fact that most of the people I spoke to were white middle-class women, right? It was just like, that was just what happened. And so paying attention to those things, and but again, I don't know if I would have been welcomed in those spaces, or if I even had a place to represent those stories as well. So I think they're important questions to reflect on. But for me, about collaborating and leading, allowing your interlocutors to kind of lead things as much as possible, and constantly reflecting and thinking about what you're doing, and but also as you go on and write about your work, talking to colleagues, talking to peers, just always kind of checking in with yourself, I think, and keeping up to date with what other scholars are doing and saying in terms of disability studies or whatever field you know, was growing at the time. So yeah, there's lots to be done. You're never finished learning, I don't think.
I'm always sort of aware that working with very vulnerable people, maybe cross-culturally or you know, cross abilities and stuff as well, is the idea of raising expectation. And they give you something, but they get nothing in return. And I think I've had many sleepless nights about that, around raising these opening up these stories or opening up these wounds, and for what reasons and motivations around that as well. And I think that for me there needs to be a whole lot of preparedness in before we go into the field, but really exploring our own processes, conscious or unconscious, of why we're doing this work. Because once we're in it and immersed, the pain that we're going to engage with is enormity. And Bridget sort of experiences around that as well, is what part of you open up of yourself and share, because the results are that, you know, it might not be what you expect. And I know quite a few people who have gone into the field, come out, have not pursued a career in anthropology or even written up their work. So I think you can look at that aspect of the horror that people engage with, and they can't do anything about it or do anything sort of transformative around it as well. There's one thing about collecting data, but when you collect other people's lives, you know, what benefit are they going to gain? And for me, working in mental health, I think that's why I've unconsciously or consciously gravitated towards becoming a therapist. And so, you know, working with anthropologists as well as different communities about engaging in that process of uncertainty, ambivalence, and also levels of suffering is really important. And I want to sort of pick up on Laura about the idea of counselling. There's an ethical tension. Of course there is, but also, you know, you don't need to, it takes a long time to become a fully fledged psychotherapist or psychoanalyst, you know, far longer than any training in anthropology. So that's never possible. So, but there's elements of the training which gives you a listening ear, gives you a level of presence and being authentic. And I think those are the parts we should be really putting into our programs, particularly around medical anthropologies, where there's a degree of vulnerability so around that as well. But I think the ethics is to look at myself. Why am I going into the field? And what am I going into? And what am I going to leave with? I think those are the questions for myself. So thank you.
If there's time, I just want to pick up on something you said, Salma, and you're right that when we talk about ethics, of course, the people we work with are at the heart of that, and are the most important people. But the ethics of our own well-being in the field and what comes out of it is also so key. And I remember filling in the ethics form before fieldwork and saying, in order to protect my own mental health, I will make sure I keep in touch with my family during fieldwork or something. And the sheer ignorance that I had of how much I would have to face my own experience and history and things in the field. And so much so that when you write, when your articles go out for peer review and you get this critique, it's like someone is personally attacking you, your life, your story, your everything. And I'm sure everyone feels that way, but this new project that I have was actually a stepping stone of, I can't work on hairpooling anymore. I have to do something that is not so intimately tied to my own life, because it was almost too much. Yeah.
I think, oh, sorry, Jackie, I think you were going to say something, but just to pick up on what Salma was saying, I think I'm in complete agreement with you. I think I was more turning inward, and these are my own insecurities about my research and the situations that I was in sometimes, about whether I should have been there. It was like you were saying, why am I doing this? Why am I here in this position? Kind of almost opening up these wounds that were sometimes very traumatic for people, and continuing to try and think about the ethical implications of being there, of doing that research, even though I didn't try and the point was never to focus on trauma or people's negative experiences or anything like that. But that's the thing about trauma, it just sort of burst through sometimes. It was uncontrollable. It was always there. So I'm more just questioning my own position within that and the places that I ended up and was doing. But I think it's also good to acknowledge that about how uncertain research can be and how overwhelmed you can feel sometimes as a researcher and just being disoriented. And that's just part of all research, I think. Anyway, but yeah, there's really interesting ethical questions that come along with that. I think Patty Lather writes quite well about empathy and the limits of empathy in research, as well as Angela Garcia, I think, on shared vulnerability, but and completely unshared experiences about having a real gap in mutual experiences. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I think kind of the emotions in the field and the emotive aspect in the field and the ethics around your emotions, it's really a very important issue, because they can lead you along certain path which might be of introspection and interiority, as Salma had raised very earlier on in this conversation, to dig deep within personal issues that affect you very deeply, but also can lead to very wrong ways of approaching the field. So there has to be a way of thinking through your emotion, thinking about your emotions before you head out to do a project with people who are vulnerable, because of the impact that this can have on yourself and then on the people you are working with or who become part of your daily life. And the other thing, of course, is what do you do with the stories they tell you, as Salma was saying earlier on. How do you retell these tales? What do you do with this? When do you draw a line? When do you stop? What can you disown, and what are you allowed to disavow as you deal with your kind of personal archive? I mean, we all have our own orphaned archives, things we haven't dealt with and we haven't wanted to talk about for one reason or another, and I think that is part of a process of ethically thinking through your experience in the field and what you've been doing with your life and the life of others. Yeah, I mean, sometimes you have to do nothing with it, and that's the best decision you can make, is do nothing with it. It's some stuff are unpublishable, unreadable. You can't do absolutely anything, because it would be a betrayal of yours and others people's experiences, really. So that's it. Well, anyway, that's my take.
Amazing. Thank you all very much for your contributions. As we only have about 2 minutes left in our scheduled event time, I'm really sorry, Sarah and Eleanor, that we're not going to be able to get to your questions. However, we're really glad that you came to this event, and we'd love for this to be more of a community at St. Andrews in medical anthropology, health, well-being. So we'd love your feedback and any questions, topics we didn't cover today that you'd like to see covered in the future, probably see next year. We'd also like to give a big thank you to Bridget, Mattia, Salma, and Laura for coming and speaking at this event. It's been really interesting, and I know I've really enjoyed getting to know more about you and your research. Yeah, if you have any questions or any feedback at all, just feel free to contact us at Anthropology Society on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. We'd love to hear from you, and thank you all very much for taking the time out of your day to come join us.
Also, speakers, if you want to plug your own social media, yeah, please do.
I've got a Twitter account called Social Ills.
I have no Twitter, no Facebook, no Instagram, no Snapchat. I only have WhatsApp, and so I'm sorry.
Thank you all so much for organising this. It's been lovely to talk to you all, and I look forward to more events.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's very stimulating, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I'm really glad you asked me to take part in this conversation. Thank you.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.